The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. My name's Arthur Brandwood. I'm the principal consultant and founder of Brandwood Biomedical, based here in Sydney, Australia, and in Beijing, China. And today I'm going to present the webinar on do I really need that clinical trial, a global approach to clinical evidence. We'll speak for about 40 minutes or so at the webinar and then follow through with a question and answer. Before I begin, I just want to do a wee bit of housekeeping. You should be looking at the webinar in a viewer screen, something like this, and you will have a separate control panel, which may be minimized into a little orange arrow like this. Click on the orange arrow if that's the case and open it out, and you'll see a box that's labeled Enter a Question for Staff. Staff, well, staff is me. If you have a question as we go through, type the question into this box. I'll be able to see it here and we'll do a Q&A at the end. Your control panel should also have a separate section labeled handouts, and you'll see that in the handouts there are a set of files which you're able to download. They include a bunch of guidance documents from Australia, China, the Europe MedEv, and an index to the many US FDA clinical trials guidances, plus a copy of the webinar slides for today. So let's just begin. This is what we're going to discuss in the next 40 minutes or so. Firstly, I'd like to just look at a little bit of history. How did we end up where we are on clinical evidence? Why is it now such a central part of medical device regulation? We'll ask a little bit about what is clinical evidence, what does it look like, how do you gather it? And then in doing all of that, I'm going to look at a number of different national and regional examples and compare and contrast them, and really work towards what are the common themes, what's the global approach to gathering clinical evidence and clinical evaluation of medical devices, and how can you manage that, including gathering international data. So before, I'd just like to make one point. We ended up here because of certain events. This particular focus we see right now on clinical evidence is here because of post-market incidents. And that's always been the case. Post-market regulation, post-market events cause pre-market changes, and there's a lot of history around that. And so, going back to the 1960s, thalidomide led to the establishment of drug regulation in many jurisdictions, including here in Australia. Before thalidomide, there was no formal drug regulation, separate regulation here in Australia, and it was established as a result of that. The Bjork-Charlie heart valve led to the formation of the devices regulatory program here in Australia after that particular episode of a design failure and a range of people getting implants which were dangerous. The Dow Corning silicon breast implants back in the 1980s, where there were alleged deficiencies in those devices, including safety issues with materials, later proven not to be the case, but that whole episode led to a big focus on device implant tracking, which for a while was mandatory in the United States, went away again, and is now coming back again in various forms around the world. And more recently, the PIP breast implant, a regulatory fraud in Europe, plus the ASR hip, plus a number of other implant failures, led to the focus on regulatory change in Europe, including stepping up the audit practices in Europe and stepping up the requirements for clinical evidence. And that's what we'll be focusing on today. So let's just look at how it used to be. The original 1993 text of the Medical Device Directive, Annex 10. And this is what it used to say for clinical requirements. As a general rule, confirmation of conformity must be based on clinical data, and particularly for implants and Class 3. And that can be done either with a compilation of literature or results of clinical investigations, clinical trials. It was very broadly written. That was it. And unfortunately, it was very broadly interpreted. So more often than not, clinical trials were short, if they existed at all, and there are a lot of literature-based submissions, even for high-risk devices. In 2002, a report on the functioning of the Medical Devices Directive said, look, we clearly have a shortcoming here. We're not doing enough about clinical data. We're not collecting the data. We're not assessing it well enough. And the directive requirements, as you saw, are pretty ambiguous. That led to the 2007 revision of the Annex 10, and here is the markup that was circulated at the time, and you can see there was a fair amount of extra material put in place which clarified that for high-risk devices, really, the expectation was direct clinical trials. But still, there was a get out. You could justify otherwise, and there was also requirements for continuous update in the market. And so here we see post-market requirements being emphasized. But still, that wasn't enough, and there were still ongoing concerns. And here we have, back in 2011, a lot of media attention around the then emerging story of the ASR, lack of clinical data for medical devices putting patients' lives at risk, as was published in The Guardian. You can still click that link and read that article. The medical director of the United Kingdom's Medical and Health Products Regulatory Agency, Susan Ludgate, was quoted that she was appalled. She was appalled at how many devices come to market without clinical data. And around the world, people were looking at this, and here in Australia, where we rely heavily on European certification as a proxy for Australian regulation, you can present your CE certificate for Australian regulatory approval, there was increasing disquiet. And in 2015, with a major review of the regulatory system in Europe, the expert reviewers didn't pull their punches. They said in recent years the European system has been shown to have systemic weaknesses, and they pointed to a number of issues, including lack of transparency about what was being done in the auditing process, insufficient rigor in audit, levels of clinical evidence just not being sufficient for many high-risk devices, and they did query the assessment standards. Now, all of that is arguable, of course, but certainly there was a disquiet here, and that led to an upgrade of the clinical evidence guidelines in Australia. And here's TGA's guidance, published just a year ago, February last year. And this is a fairly concise guidance compared to others, but it's pretty comprehensive nonetheless. It provides the key definitions and concepts and tells you what clinical evidence is, how to write that up, and gives a very clear expectations for the format and content of your clinical evaluation report and what supporting documents, and talks about some of the mistakes that people make in preparing those, and some really practical guidance there. And brings in this concept of demonstrating substantial equivalence. And this I find particularly interesting because we've seen in the development of clinical evidence requirements increasing reliance or inclusion of substantial equivalence discussion to predicate devices or similar devices. So this is really where we're seeing the US FDA 510K concept of substantial equivalence finding its way into other regulatory systems in terms of the comparison with other devices, only the comparison is specifically a clinical one. That's now been formalized in that Australian guidance and in other places, which we'll look at in a moment. Let's just look at what that TGA guidance says in a bit more detail. It talks about what are the key characteristics of a clinical investigation. And really there are four things. What's the scope? How complete is your evidence? The fact that the whole thing needs to be balanced and based on risk, and the fact that the whole thing has to be done and, or at least endorsed, reviewed and signed off by somebody with appropriate expertise. So let's look at each of those in turn. Scope is straightforward. It simply means that you must, when doing your clinical evaluation, be clear about what the device is, both its actual design characteristics, whether it's sterile, non-sterile, single, multiple use, all of those sorts of things, but also what you intend it to be used for, what's your specific intended use, and what contraindications or warnings exist. So what's the actual nature of the device and what's the nature of its use, and that needs to be clearly spelled out. Otherwise, the regulator will say, well, does this clinical evidence actually apply to your device or not? And that's a common mistake. People do not spell that out clearly in the clinical evaluation report. Secondly, completeness of the data. And these days, it's not sufficient just to do a literature review. There is an expectation that the clinical evaluation report will consider your risk management, will consider preclinical testing, whether it be animal testing or biological safety or mechanical and physical testing, product safety testing. All of the preclinical stuff needs to be considered and referenced and reviewed in the clinical evaluation report. Literature review, of course, but also post-market data. What have you got from your in-house records? What's available in public sources about your device or similar devices? So things like registries, things like the regulators' adverse event databases, things like we'll come back right at the end, things like other public databases for reimbursement and so on. There's increasingly looking at real-world evidence. And then right at the top, direct clinical trials if it's a high-risk device or a novel technology. Is the literature search adequate? And I've seen clinical evaluation reports submitted to the regulator which simply consisted of a box full of papers from the literature saying, here's the evidence, with no commentary, no review, and no interest in the regulator in accepting that, of course. That gets rejected, but I have seen people do some silly things like that. The regulators are becoming much more clear on what the expectation is, and it's a high expectation. You need to specify which databases you searched and justify why you used them or did not use particular databases. You need to set out how you went about constructing your search and justify that. You need to look at the inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria for the papers you retrieved from the search, and really justify, okay, why did you review those particular papers and what brought you to the final data set in the literature that you reviewed. And that's set out in the TGA guidance, and it's set out in others. And the overriding principle is, can the regulator reconstruct your literature search from the information you provided? If they can't do that, they're likely to say, give us more information. Those of you who are heavily involved in clinical research will recognize this, levels of evidence, and these days clinical evaluation reports really need to speak to this to say, well, what's the quality of each paper you've reviewed? How much weight do we give the different articles from the literature? And finally, the report needs to be balanced, and it needs to demonstrate a favorable risk-benefit ratio. So you need to talk about the risks identified, what sort of things may go wrong in terms of performance failures, complications, patient risks, and how you mitigate those risks from the design, and what are the clinical benefits of the device. Balance both in terms of the conduct of the risk assessment and the fact that you've done that properly, and balance in terms of a balanced review where you really have considered the good and the bad and weighed it all up. And then this needs to be signed off, and TGA's specific requirement is that the clinical evaluation report is signed, written, or at least signed and endorsed by an individual with appropriate clinical qualifications relevant to the device, and basically somebody who would have experience in the use of that type of device in the clinical setting you intend to use it in. Now, that clinical expert doesn't necessarily have to be a doctor. It usually is, but there are other alternatives. So, you can have a cardiac physician for an endovascular stent, but it may be a more appropriate clinical expert may be a nurse for, say, a commonly used disposable equipment in day-to-day practice, and we've done this, a paramedic. We actually had a clinical evaluation report signed off by a paramedic for a piece of equipment used in an air ambulance. So it's appropriate clinical experience for the actual use. You want somebody who really is familiar with the use of that device to be able to sign off and say, yes, this device will perform in the clinic as expected, because that's the question that's being asked. And TGA's guidance goes further in that it has specific advice on requirements for certain high-risk devices. And it's quite interesting if you look at that list and you look to other jurisdictions, and a good example being China, you'll see a similar set of guidances. The regulators the world over are all worried about the same things. There are particular devices where they'll give quite precise guidance. And just as an aside, if you're wondering what TGA's view is on demonstrating safety of implantable medical devices in MRI environments, so MRI compliance, this is where that guidance is buried in the middle of their clinical evaluation guidance. So that's all what was happening in Australia. Let's just go back to what was going on in Europe. As I said, all of this really started by people looking again at the European regulatory system. So through that same period in the early 2010s to 2010 onwards, the Europeans were working rather painfully slowly on developing the new medical device regulations and updating the clinical evidence guidance, the MedDev 2.7/1, producing a new version 4 document, which is very comprehensive indeed. But let's first of all just look at the new medical device regulations, not yet implemented in Europe. They were just starting down that road of implementing the MDR. But what does it say about clinical evidence now? And here's what it says, and I'm not going to read that out, but there are three really important clauses of Chapter 6. The Clause 3, which says what should a clinical evaluation look like. Clause 4 says implantable devices, and Class 3, it's really quite clear now that a clinical evaluation is expected, and it talks about use of predicates. So let's just summarize all of that. So it basically says, well, you need to have a clearly defined and methodologically sound procedure, echoes of what's in the TGA guidance there. Talks specifically about the literature review and how that speaks specifically to safety, performance, design, and intended purpose, all the same things I've just spoken about. That substantial equivalence issue is right in there but it goes further and says substantial equivalence is not just clinical equivalence, it needs to be also in terms of the technical features, the biological safety, and the clinical features of the device. The data need to speak to the underlying general safety and performance requirements, what used to be called the essential requirements in Europe, essential principles in Australia, and now called the general safety and performance requirements. So this still needs to point back to the underlying regulations. There needs to be critical evaluation of actual clinical study results where they exist, and you need to do this in the context not just of your device and predicate devices like it, but what are the alternative treatment options. So it says clearly, when you're considering the clinical performance and safety of a new device, how does it stack up against something else, like maybe taking a medicine? You need to think about the whole context. Coming back to the requirement for clinical investigations, the MedDev Chapter 6 is quite clear. Class 3 devices and all implants are expected to require direct clinical investigations unless the device is a design iteration of something else by the same manufacturer and you can show a very close substantial equivalence. Apologies for the typo there. And you can produce a clinical evaluation report that speaks to safety and performance. So you can show that basically you have enough clinical evidence for the previous version and the changes you've made here don't require you to go back to the clinic. You can use other devices from another manufacturer if, and pardon the joke, but it's a big if you have a direct contract with that other manufacturer that says they will give you access to their primary clinical data and continued ongoing access into the future. All I can say is good luck with that. That's put there in the regulation, but it seems to be an entirely impractical arrangement in almost all circumstances. Nobody is going to give a competitor access to their primary clinical data to allow that competitor to ride on their device to get a regulatory approval. And that predicate device itself must have a compliant clinical evaluation report in place. So Europe revised its MedDev 2.7.1. Here it is here, and it has a guidance which sets out in stages how to do a clinical evaluation. So starting off with scoping and planning, doing the literature review, identifying the pertinent data from all sources, appraising that data, analyzing it, and then writing a report. Fairly obvious and straightforward. What are the key requirements in MedDev 2.7.1? Firstly, clinical evaluation for everything. Every device, irrespective of its class. A class 1 device, even a very low-risk device, still needs a clinical evaluation. It may be a much more abbreviated document if it's a very low-risk device, and the cliche is the tongue depressor. You might have a simple letter on file, almost, for something as low as that, something very simple. The level of evidence, of course, rises with the risk class of the device. The higher the risk, the more you have to do, to the point of always doing clinical trials for high-risk devices unless you can justify. And that's going to be really hard to justify not having direct clinical evidence under the new guidance, the new MDR. Thorough literature review, comparison to substantial equivalence devices, and based on technical and biological characteristics. So you can see the same things coming through over and over again. One thing the Europeans have done is they've gone beyond what Australia has done. Australia for many years has required this, had this specific requirement that a clinical expert sign off the report. It's not allowed to be done by a product specialist in the company or whatever. In the latest MedDev guidance, the Europeans go one step further and they say, well, actually, this is a team activity. That this needs, yes, a specialist clinical expertise, but it also needs people who are skilled in research methods, biostatistics, regulatory professionals, medical writers, a team to produce a proper clinical evaluation. And it says something about what's considered to be professional qualifications. In other words, they're looking for people who've got a degree and maybe 5 years experience, or no qualifications but 10 years in the field. So, and that needs to be documented. You're going to have to put the qualifications of the people who contributed to the report in your report, including things like CVs of the key clinical specialist. I'd like to turn now to how this is done in China. That's the Peking Union Medical College Hospital, one of the largest cancer hospitals in China, in Beijing. We're currently running a bunch of clinical trials in the hospital on a range of oncology diagnostics. Here's a list of just some of the regulations for clinical studies and clinical evidence in China, and I'm not going to go through all of those, but just to say it's a complicated system in China. But essentially the principle in China is that for class 2 and class 3 devices, there is a 3-tier classification in China. Class 2 and 3 devices, the default is that you will do a clinical trial and you'll do that in China. Lots of if, buts, and maybes around that. Class 1 devices do not need a clinical trial. But there are some exemptions. So CFDA started with the new regulations in 2014, said everything needs a clinical trial, and then immediately produced a list of about 500 devices which were exempted, and since then has extended that list from time to time. There's now a total of just over 1,000 devices, including 145 IVDs, which do not require clinical trials in China. Just to give an example, there's the current list of all of the IVDs, which are class 2 or class 3, mainly class 2, and which don't require direct clinical trials. They do require clinical validation, though, which still means you need to go to a clinical laboratory to do that. Now, exempted devices still require comparison to a predicate, and it has to be an in-China registered predicate. And you'll recognize this sort of table as really borrowed straight from the US FDA practice. There is a guidance. Here's the announcement on the CFDA website, and in your handouts you'll see an English language translation of the China guidance. And And we'll just look a little bit at what that guidance says. Same things you see as you see in the European and Australian guidances. Levels of evidence appears, specific requirements for certain devices. So if you want to avoid a trial, there is still a way of doing that by a clinical evaluation report with a predicate. Provided the predicate's the same class, it's approved in China for the same intended use, and you don't have significant technical differences. However, same problem applies in Europe. High levels of detail are required. The China FDA requires a contract in the same way the European MDR, granting access to predicate clinical data. And really the only feasible predicate is an earlier design variant from the same manufacturer. So the CFDA have done what they've been doing for some years. They have actually looked around the world at what they consider to be the best practices, and they're borrowing them into the Chinese system. And they've certainly picked up exactly the same practice. They're members of IMDRF, that CFDA talk to the other regulators. They're all going down the same path. Middle of last year, Circular 53 came out where the CFDA said, look, we want to modernize our whole approach to clinical practice and the controls. And they've done a number of things about making it easier to do clinical trials in China, moving to a lead side ethics review model, so you're not having a problem of trying to navigate multiple ethics committees so much, getting rid of the list of certified clinical trial sites and allowing sites to self-qualify against objective criteria. That's a new process, and the first couple of sites are now qualified. And at the same time, strengthening audits. So clinical trials in China are audited. They're audited by the local FDA, not the national one. But they're quite strict, and failure of audit can have quite significant consequences. A failure of audit can result in a registration refusal for applications supported by the study, and if the failure is bad enough, it can result in you being locked out from applying for new registrations for a period of time. And that's happened to even some of the biggest names in the industry. So it is really important, if you're doing clinical trials in China, that you do them properly and you have adequate monitoring arrangements in place to ensure that the data are collected properly. Simple examples, clinical trial of an IVD last year from a big name manufacturer ended up accidentally with some duplicate samples in the data set. Some patients had represented during the course of the study, and duplicate samples, even though the protocol said no duplicate samples, it was detected on audit, and the trial failed the clinical audit, even though the analysis showed that the statistical effect on the outcome was negligible. It didn't actually change the outcome of the trial. Nonetheless, that trial failed its audit and the registration application was refused. You do have to be careful. China, having said you have to do an in-China trial in 2014, has now turned around and started to think again. Here's just an excerpt from a blog on our own website when this was announced last year in January, and the agency's been looking at that more and more, and is considering, well, how can they accept international data? And here's how China looks at that, and it's really quite interesting because as we step through this, you'll see it's very much at the way other regulators look at this, and the US FDA certainly does this. So firstly, China won't accept international data unless it conforms to the Helsinki Declaration, that it's done under appropriate good clinical practice, usually the ISO 14155 or equivalent. They expect you to both comply with the requirements in the country where the trial is done, as well as comply with the Chinese requirements. And there are some differences, and if you want to look at that, go back to the recording, the slides of the webinar that we gave a couple of months ago that look specifically at China GCP. One of the key differences is there have been considerable concerns about clinical trial fraud in China, and so China expects the data analysis to be under the control of the principal investigator and not the sponsor. That's different to how it's done in ISO 14155. China does expect to see the independent clinician, the principal investigator, actually controlling the data analysis to ensure integrity of the data. Whether that works or not is arguable. That's the requirement. Quality systems have to be in place in line with China GCP, all of that, as well as integrity of the data, that the data are authentic, that they're complete. You can't provide selective screen data. You need to give the whole story, and that the study design, of course, is adequate. The China guidance is quite specific, and there have been subsequent statements from the agency as well as to what needs to be submitted. So you need, as a minimum, in your clinical submission part of your registration dossier, full trial protocol, the full ethics committee opinion, and the full clinical trial report, obviously with the analysis inclusions, but also supported by the complete clinical data set. You do need to give them the full, unexpurgated, unscreened data set. That's expected to be filed. If you're looking to provide international clinical data, this is how the CFDA will review it. They'll look at the things I've just said. They say they will look at what are the technical differences between the overseas and CFDA GCP requirements, and do they matter? So if you've got studies which are not controlled directly by, where the analysis is not controlled by the principal investigator, you're going to have to justify that still the analysis was done properly. You need to look at the obvious things like different epidemiological factors, race, gender, ethnicity, things like that. And you need to look at clinical practice in the place where the trial was done compared to how it's done in China. US FDA asks exactly the same thing. Is that study population and the way medicine is practiced in that country equivalent to Australia? It's equivalent to the US, my apologies. We've had that same issue where they've said, well, is medicine practiced the same way in Australia as it is in the US? Are the clinical data from an Australian study site applicable to a US regulatory submission? Same goes on in China. And the guidance has some specific examples. I think these are rather simplistic, but they are what they are. For example, a clinical trial on a pulse oximeter, you need to look at what's the skin tone differences between different ethnic groups, and does that matter? I would expect not, but it needs to be looked at. Genetic testing, you'll need to look at prevalence of different mutations in different populations. And if you're looking at diagnostics, you clearly need to speak to the specific genotypes that you're testing for in the market of interest. So for hepatitis, you'll be looking at B, C, and D for China. Same for most places, of course. But the key issues are you need to consider the mix of ethnicity in international patient data sets, look at the GCP practices, and make sure, above all, that the protocol stands up and the data stand up to scrutiny. I have seen things done like a large US study where there's been a sub cohort analysis done within the data set, looking at the ethnic Chinese patients within the broader study population and comparing their outcomes to the rest of the study population, showing there's no difference, and therefore that the entire study data set is applicable to the China circumstance. And I'm aware that that has been accepted by CFDA. So, coming back to where we were, a global approach. Let's just summarize this. Firstly, think global, act local, know the local requirements. So, what are the local clinical trial requirements? Make sure you do a robust literature review. Make sure you think about post-market data. Think about predicate devices, and do that in the context of the market that you're entering into, and make sure you've got appropriate clinical expertise. And those are pretty much common to all places. Remember this about scope, completeness, balance, and expertise. Those things need to be thought about every time you're writing a clinical evaluation report, and I won't go into further detail again. But leveraging international data, it's about population and clinical practice, and are they comparable, and making sure that you know the local guidances. And each of these three guidances, the TGA one is not a draft anymore, of course, that's a year, this slide's a little old. It's now a final guidance published a year ago, and all of those guidances are available as handouts for you to download from the control panel. always check the individual product guidances that may exist for overriding requirements. So this is particularly the case in the United States, where the FDA has a lot of individual product guidances. The special controls arrangements and the PMA regulatory requirements in the US are predicated on FDA publishing specific guidance for specific products. That's helpful in high-risk devices where there's a guidance in place where it will tell you what sort of things are expected in your clinical trial design. It's also helpful where specific guidance exists for lower-risk devices where it will tell you you don't need clinical data. Where the product guidance is based on specified testing and standards compliance, it makes it clear that clinical trials are not required. So something like a medical glove doesn't require clinical trials usually. Let's just finish now with the US FDA. It's clearer in the US FDA. High-risk devices where a PMA is required pretty much always require a clinical trial. The PMA process is based upon submissions of preclinical and clinical data, and in fact the PMA process can be modular, and you can submit the preclinical and start the regulatory process before you've finished the clinical module and submit the clinical data later. 510Ks are not quite so clear. Still, the bulk of 510Ks do not have direct clinical data in the submission, but that ratio is changing. More and more 510Ks do require clinical data, and the first place to look is in the special controls for the specific device class that you're dealing with, because the special controls themselves will speak to whether you need to consider having clinical data. De novo 510Ks frequently do require clinical data. The very fact that you have a new device that's not classified and usually looking to down classify from a default class 3 means that you are going to be needing to look at clinical data to support a de novo 510K in a lot of cases. The FDA, as I've already said, prefers US data, and if you're in doubt, consider a pre-sub. Consider talking to the agency about what their specific expectations are, and for very new technologies, that's a very valuable exercise because you can actually have the FDA look at your protocol and have a conversation with them about the approaches you're going to take. They won't review actual results and data in a pre-sub, but they will talk about protocol design. And finally, last slide, this is a very interesting thing that's come out of FDA a little while ago on real-world evidence. The FDA is being quite creative in talking about, well, what other things can we do rather than just going off and doing clinical trials, and particularly what they call real-world evidence. And by that they mean things like looking at registries, things like analyzing collections of electronic health records, things like looking at healthcare claims databases, and doing analyses of those very large data sets, which is now much more possible, of course, to get real-world evidence about the actual performance of medical devices. So that's quite an interesting guidance. I'd recommend it as a bit of a thought-provoking read about different ways to approach this. So at that point, I'm going to stop, and we'll take some questions. It's now time for a Q&A. So I have a bunch of questions here. Stuart asked the question that says, since no European notified bodies are yet able to issue CE certificates to the updated MDR, do we need to comply with revision 4 of the MedDev today, especially for updates to existing CE mark products? Very good question, very controversial issue. My understanding of the practices are that you don't yet need to comply with the updated version, although notified bodies strongly prefer that you do. The answer really is talk to your notified body and get a specific feedback from the notified body about that. And most companies are in transition because you will need to comply with it eventually. What had happened was that as the new guidance came in, notified bodies were expecting to see clinical evidence in compliance with it, but a number of them at least have backed away from that position at the moment. Talk to your notified body about that one, Stuart. Romet asks about a specific issue of clinical evidence for something like systems or procedure packs, and how they're documented. Imagine a procedure pack which has components of different classes, 2A and class 3, and the substantial equivalent device in the market is only a class 3 as a single device. Well, with procedure packs, really you're needing to look at the clinical evidence both for the individual components, which should be available from the individual device manufacturers, as well as the kit as a whole. So, and really a kit manufacturer needs to be doing two things. They need to be having arrangements in place with their suppliers so that clinical data and all other regulatory and technical file data is able to be made available to the regulator on request. So if you market a procedure kit and you get your parts from different places, then you really do need to be able to get information from the suppliers of the individual components, either to you or directly to the regulator if the regulator asks for it. But then it is your responsibility then to consider the clinical evidence for the whole kit, and that really needs not to focus on the individual components of the devices, but how they all come together. So that's a different assessment. That's, well, are all these things compatible? Do they work together? And does the fact that we deliver them together change any of the clinical performance? Usually, in fact, the argument is that because you're providing a convenience kit, you are reducing risks because you're providing a set of devices that you know to work together. You wouldn't necessarily be repeating a clinical trial on a procedure kit because the clinical evidence should be in place already for the individual components. Val asks about how does one demonstrate that the principal investigator is independent? That's a very good question. There's a differing and inconsistent level of comfort with, for example, having clinical investigators that may be associated with the company, with the sponsor. Is the principal investigator being paid? Are they on the payroll of the company? Or are they genuinely an independent researcher where the sponsor is funding the study but is not paying them in any other way? That's really managed in the first instance in the same way that the medical journals look at that question of investigator independence, where there is required to be full disclosure of any conflict of interest or any pecuniary interest in a device trial. But then when that investigator is signing off a clinical evaluation report, I'm not talking about a clinical study now, but actually signing off the evaluation report, regulators sometimes want to see an independent person, not having a pecuniary interest in the device, signing off the report. That can be problematic where you've got a completely novel technology where in fact the clinician inventor may be the person driving much of the clinical evaluation, and they may be writing the report or having a big input. If there's a doubt in that, my usual advice is consider having a second clinician do a review. That can be difficult, particularly if that second clinician prefers a different type of practice, but it can be a really useful review to have a protagonist look at you, and it's a reality check. But consider having a second clinician do an independent review and endorse the report. Massa Mohammed asks, what guidances do we have to follow if we conduct a clinical trial in Australia and use it in a 510K submission? I go back to what I was saying earlier about the acceptability of international data. So if you're going to do a trial here in Australia and you are then going to put the data from that trial into a US 510K, you really need to be confident that the FDA will accept those data, and that needs to be considered in terms of those two things I discussed. Is the clinical trial, is the population of patients in Australia equivalent to the US? And is the practice here equivalent to the US? And the answer to those questions isn't necessarily yes. So for example, I've seen examples where with looking at diagnostic devices for melanoma, taking pictures of the skin and so on. You have a different ethnic mix in America to what exists here in Australia. You may need to consider different skin types with different ethnicities. In that case, does your clinical trial population here cover all the skin types that are likely to be found in America and show adequately that the device will work? That kind of device will work on that patient population. Is the clinical practice the same here? I've seen FDA require local clinical trials for laboratory instruments because they believe that laboratory practices are different in the US to what they are in other markets. So you really need to be clear on that. And if you're not clear, really do talk to the FDA, engage in a 510 in a pre-submission. Let me just have a look at what here. Stephanie asks, Stephanie and Grant together say, what is the view on post-market clinical follow-up documentation versus simpler data which will be required to keep the clinical evidence report up to date? I think the place which is looking at this most stringently at the moment is in Europe, where there will be requirements for periodic update of the post-market data set, and for high-risk devices, actual annual updates of your clinical evaluation report based on post-market experience in the prior year, and updating your literature reviews and updating the whole evaluation report. It yet remains to be seen how that's going to play out in Europe. Those reports have to be submitted every year. You're going to have to pay your notified body additional fees for reviewing them, and in some cases they're going to end up being public documents on the UDAMED database. It really remains to be seen how that's done. But I'd like to just point out another place where this is important, that is in China. In China, regulatory approvals for individual devices are subject to review and renewal now every 5 years. In the changes in the regulation in 2014 with the new Order 650, one of the significant changes was that those renewals, which used to be simply a repeat of the entire review process, including retesting the device, the CFDA abandoned that process and turned the renewal submission into essentially a review of post-market data. So when you go back to CFDA, you really need to go back with a submission that says the device design hasn't changed, and here's the evidence, the data set we've got from our own in-house data and from what's in the literature and what's available from public sources that confirm that the risk assessment's still valid, that this device is still safe and effective. I don't think there's any way around this, Grant. You're going to have really good in-house clinical data sets, and perhaps the best lesson of all on that has been here in Australia, where in the orthopedic space we have a very good international national joint replacement registry which captures more than 95% of all joint implants in Australia and provides very comprehensive data sets, and which calls out devices which have higher than expected revision rates. TGA takes a very strong interest in the outcomes of the registry each year and follows up on those devices with higher than average revision rates, essentially with a please explain as to justify that these devices are still safe and effective compared to their peers. And that has resulted in a substantial change in the compliance of orthopedic distributors and manufacturers in Australia with post-market requirements, because the simple truth is, if your device is identified in a public data set like a registry as perhaps not having as good a performance as it needs to be, for whatever reasons, and there may sometimes be good reasons for that, then the regulators are going to take a strong look at that. And if you don't have strong in-house data on the post-market performance of your device, which you've collected yourself, then you really are defenseless. You cannot defend yourself against a regulator who's saying, well, I just see the registry says your device isn't as good as others. Why shouldn't it be taken off the market? So post-market data sets are really important. Now, let me just see other questions here. Susan asks, is the China FDA open to discussion on clinical strategy prior to committing to a registration trial? Very good question, Susan, and a difficult one. The answer is China FDA is actually quite difficult to do pre-consultations with. They don't have a formal pre-consult process. They specifically for devices which are going through routine registration paths don't like to do pre-consults. So it's up to you to get this right. The major exception to that rule is devices which are new technologies, where they may qualify for the innovative device pathway in China. And that innovative device pathway includes a formal pre-consultation process and ongoing consultation with the regulator throughout the entire regulatory review. So China FDA's review policy essentially says for stuff that's normal, that's an existing classification, that are devices that we know about, it's really up to the manufacturer to get it right themselves and to come forward to stand on their own feet, design their own protocols and come forward with a data set. But where it's new and different, then they are very open to pre-consultations if you qualify for the innovative device pathway. If you go down that road, the first thing to think about with the innovative device pathway is that you will require a clinical trial. By definition, it's innovative, it's new, therefore the CFDA's position is you must do a clinical trial. The innovative device pathway is considered to be an expedited pathway by many. That's, in my view, a mistaken analysis. The China's innovative device pathway is not necessarily any quicker. It requires you, for example, to undertake a pre-qualification process, which adds a couple of months up front. It's doubtful that the notional priority queuing really does give you much priority, but what it does do is give you a much greater quality of dialogue with the agency and pre-consultation. So the answer to your question, Susan, is not really unless you're doing the innovative device pathway, although it is possible if you've got the right regulatory advisors in China to do informal consultations with the CFDA, but you've got to know who to speak to. And that's really only can be done by people who've got a good experience working in that market, and can have those conversations, but you're not going to get formal feedback. Michael says, what's the TGA stance on real-world clinical data? Good question, Michael. Simple answer is, haven't got the foggiest. I really don't know where TGA would be on that at the moment, although having said that, they have been so keen to look at registries for a long time. There's no formal policy stance from the TGA, but my perception would be that they would be very open to that approach. But you'd have to justify it strongly. They've used the joint registry as the basis of post-market review of orthopedic implants for many years now, and I don't see why they wouldn't be open to you coming forward with other real-world data to support clinical evaluations. Ted says, what advice would you give for developing clinical evidence to support CE mark renewal of a very long established, say more than 25 years, coronary guide wire? You know how to ask the easy questions, Ted. That's a hot topic right now. What about long established devices? How do you take those forwards where there may not be any recent clinical evaluations, because the very fact that those devices are long used, nobody's going to do another clinical trial on a guide wire that's been around for a quarter of a century. And paradoxically, if you look at the TGA clinical evidence practice, they like to see you review data that are less than 10 years old. And if you've got old data, they'll say go back and look for new data. And there won't be new data for things like guide wires that have been around forever. There won't be new data on standard medical gloves. There won't be new data on other things that have been around in clinical practice for decades. It's a challenging one, and it's quite interesting. I saw a note circulated on LinkedIn from Basil Akra at TÜV Süd just about a week ago, and there's a reference to it actually on the blog post on our website, where the notified bodies right now are asking for case studies because there is a guidance in the works in Europe on this very issue of how to deal with it. So the notified bodies group is working on preparing a guidance on how to do this, and they're looking for case studies from manufacturers which they can put into that development process. They're looking for anonymous case studies. They don't want to name names. They just want to look at the kinds of suggestions from manufacturers as to what sort of approaches would be reasonable and practical and satisfactorily address the risk. So, Ted, I have signally not answered your question, but the point is that nobody's really got the answer to that right now, but the notified bodies are looking at it closely. So I'd suggest you talk to your notified body about what they're thinking and maybe give them some input. Coming up to the hour, so I'm going to just finish with maybe one more question. Let me just see. And I haven't had a chance to get to every question. But here's a last one again from Val. Often multinationals have an in-house clinical expert that signs off on the CR. We've seen this being challenged by the TGA recently. What to do about that? What to do? And I think I spoke to that in an answer to an earlier question. I've seen that challenge as well. I'm also aware that notified bodies are happy to sign off clinical evaluation reports written by an in-house medical director, for example, or somebody who's been involved in the development of the device. And I've seen TGA do that in the past, although they do appear to be changing their stance, although they've not said anything officially. I think, Val, the same answer is there, that if in doubt, have another clinician not associated with the device development and design review the report and countersign it. And provide their CV. That's the best way forward to do that. You don't have to get them directly involved in writing the report, but they do need to review the final one and sign off on a simple statement. You can put a cover letter and say that they've reviewed it and they concur with the findings. That's probably the easiest way to deal with that. So at that point, I'm going to stop. I think I've answered most of the questions. If I've missed any, I will be in touch by email. If you think of something later, ask us by email. It's a simple email to respond to, help@brandwoodbiomedical.com. And you can follow us for future webinars. Look at our website, the blogs, follow me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and have a look at our YouTube channel or on the website for training videos. Most of our webinars are recorded. This one has been recorded and the video will be up there later for you to watch again. Download the slides and the handouts. One final thing before I go, I want to point out this, just looking at the website. If you've been interested particularly in what's going on in China and other parts of the Asia Pacific, consider coming along to the Asia Pacific Device Summit to be held not very long from now in California, in Orange County on March 19th to 20, where we'll have a bunch of presentations from experts across the Asia Pacific on current regulatory requirements, and including specifically a presentation from Yongheng Chang, who is the past director of the China Center for Food and Drug International Exchange. That's the international division of the China FDA. And Mr. Chang is also the executive director of the China International Medical Device Regulatory Forum, which is the very big conference that happens in China every year. It's the world's largest medical device regulatory conference. He's going to be at that meeting, and he'll be talking specifically about taking innovative devices through CFDA and how the innovative device pathways are working. So if you want to talk directly to a senior CFDA official and from experts across the region, I'd highly recommend joining the Asia Pacific Device Summit. And don't wait too long, because it's going to be capped at about 50 people. It's quite an intimate event. It's not a large conference, and we want to have it goes for 2 days, a deep dive and a really involved discussion. Having said that, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to speaking to many of you again next month in our next webinar.